Hello, my name is Chuck Easley, and the title of this paper is Failure is an Option, Failure Barriers and New Firm Performance. And this is co-authored work with Robert Eberhard and Kathy Eisenhart. The motivation for this paper starts with my broader research agenda, which is an interest in the intersection of institutions and entrepreneurship. And in this area, I've been tackling this broader question from three different perspectives, looking at formal institutions, like policies and regulation, more informal institutions such as social movement organizations, and then in the middle, looking at the effects of industry context. So on the formal side, I've been looking at how changes in the broader policy environment can shape what types of individuals become entrepreneurs and what types of strategies lead to higher performance. And I typically do this using natural experiments in the form of institutional and policy changes. In terms of industry context, I've been looking at how the type of industry and the broader environment shapes which strategies lead to greater performance for entrepreneurial firms. And then finally, looking at more informal institutions, I have a line of work which has looked at how social movement organizations, such as nonprofit environmental groups, can influence firm innovation, and also how networks versus institutions can shape performance in an emerging economy context. And so this paper fits in with this research stream in that it follows up on earlier work which has looked at how changes in the institutional environment can help to encourage the best and the brightest and the most talented individuals in society to become entrepreneurs. So the motivation for this paper specifically comes out of seeing a lot of national efforts to try and influence new firm formation. So across many countries, from Startup America to Startup Chile, we've seen policy efforts to try and spur entrepreneurship. And the overall message that my work is trying to convey is that more entrepreneurship is not necessarily better, that we want better entrepreneurs, not necessarily more entrepreneurs. So we have little evidence so far that the types of reforms that we're seeing can actually lead to higher performing new firms or to economic growth. And in fact, we have some evidence that these types of reforms that lower the entry barriers might actually increase the formation of lower performing firms. Previous research on institutions and firm formation has linked failure and firm founding in many ways, either in terms of failure in one sector influencing founding in another, or looking at how failed firms, some of their knowledge is then recycled into new firms. Just to quickly summarize the previous literature in this area, we know that lowering the institutional barriers to entry tends to increase the rate of new firm formation. We also have some emerging literature that I've contributed to and others that lowering certain institutional barriers, particularly barriers to firm growth or barriers to exit or failure, can also shift the mix of the type of people who tend to start firms. And so this follows from some of my work and also from some previous work that's looked at bankruptcy reforms and firm formation, which has found that in states in the US that have a more punitive bankruptcy system, they tend to cause those who are homeowners to be relatively less likely to found firms as compared to those who are renters. So there's still many open questions, and particularly some important ones in this area. How do government reforms influence new firm performance, which is clearly highly relevant for job creation and economic growth? And second, how are founding, failure, and the types of entrepreneurs and their performance related, which is particularly relevant for getting at the mechanisms of how these reforms in the institutional environment actually work. So the research question I'm going to look at here is, how do government reforms in the institutional environment influence the formation and performance of new firms? And so the setting that I'm going to be looking at this in is bankruptcy reform in Japan. Prior to 2003, the Japanese bankruptcy laws were quite harsh. In 2003, there was the corporate reorganization law. And so this law basically made it much less punitive to go through the bankruptcy process. It included protection of personal assets. It resulted in a faster, more rational resolution, and didn't require the firm management to be fired any longer. And so it made it much less punitive, much less personally painful for individuals to go through the bankruptcy process. So the three main hypotheses that we're going to look at here. The first hypothesis is about the effects of lowering failure barriers. And we hypothesize that lowering the barriers to failure, or to firm exit more precisely, will increase the likelihood of bankruptcy, particularly among elite entrepreneurs. And I'll talk in a minute how we define elites. So this bankruptcy reform lowered the time, effort, and cost, as well as the personal consequences of going through bankruptcy. The elite entrepreneurs, those who are higher in human and social capital, have more at risk. And so when the bankruptcy law is punitive, they're less likely to file for bankruptcy. They'll find some way to stay in business. But if it's less punitive, then elites will be more likely to file for bankruptcy because they have better career alternatives and higher opportunity cost to remaining in a poorly performing firm. The second hypothesis is about founding effects. Here we argue that institutional reforms that lower failure barriers will increase the likelihood that elite individuals start new firms. This is because less elite individuals, those who are less talented, tend to be pushed into entrepreneurship. They tend to have fewer outside options, and becoming self-employed is often kind of option of last resort. And so they're more likely to start firms when entry barriers fall, which I've shown in previous work. Elite entrepreneurs, on the other hand, have a lot of attractive outside options, and so they're more likely to be pulled into entrepreneurship when there's a good opportunity, but they're not forced into it. And so for elite entrepreneurs, the reduction of risk is going to disproportionately influence them, because being higher in human and social capital, they have a lot more at stake, and a lot more that they could lose from a punitive bankruptcy system. The third hypothesis is related to performance effects, and here we argue that lowering the failure barriers will increase the performance of new firms. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, as we noted earlier, it will result in more elite entrepreneurs starting to found firms. And we know from previous literature that elite entrepreneurs tend to be more likely to start higher performing firms. It's because they're higher in human capital and also higher in social capital. Second, it will cause these elite individuals to pursue better entrepreneurial opportunities that are higher risk and higher reward perhaps, and also to manage more effectively, where they're managing for growth rather than managing to avoid failure and bankruptcy. In the Japanese context, elite founders are defined as having attended top universities and as being older. These characteristics fit with what's perceived as being elite in Japanese society. And both of these also enhance human and social capital. So the entry of elite entrepreneurs should result in higher performing ventures as defined by venture growth. So the data that we look at for this comes from a natural experiment with the Japanese bankruptcy reform in 2003. We use data on approximately 16,000 Japanese corporations from the Teikoku Databank, which is pretty much the equivalent of the Dun & Bradstreet database in the US, where they get their samples, where they're essentially the leading Japanese credit agency. We use firms that are founded between 1954 and 2008. Essentially, we have the universe of firms that were incorporated from 1998 to 2008. We took out any subsidiaries and non-operating companies, and this database is frequently used by Japanese scholars. So for our variables, we have three key dependent variables. The first is a bankruptcy event, where we're running a panel logit regression. The second is 0-1 variable for entry, where we're looking at founding after the 2003 bankruptcy reform. And then finally, we use compound annual growth rates as our firm performance measure. Our key independent variables are being an elite entrepreneur, which we measure by attending one of the top 10 universities in Japan, and also by the CEO age at founding. And then we're going to use a post-reform founding dummy variable, which is equal to 1 if the firm was founded after 2002. We control for a number of factors which capture the initial conditions as well as time-varying conditions. So we control for the initial capital, the industry that they're in, the initial macroeconomic environment, as well as changes in the GDP growth over time. So this figure shows in graphical form essentially the results that we find on growth. So here we're looking at 4-year growth rates for firms founded in 2002, just before the reform, and then for firms founded in 2004, about a year after the reform. And we see that particularly for the top quantile of growth rates, the 95th quantile, we see that the most quickly growing firms are growing significantly faster after the reform, with less of an effect on those who are at the bottom of the growth rate distribution. And this effect occurs across industries. So you can see 0 is before the reform and 1 is after the reform. And so after this reform, firms are growing significantly faster. In terms of the bankruptcy results, here we're running a panel regression on a 0-1 binary variable of whether the firm went bankrupt in that particular year. And the key results that we're looking at here are the interactions between elite university and post-reform. And so post-reform, we see that we do see that those who are older are significantly more likely to file for bankruptcy. We also see a positive coefficient on those who come from elite universities, but this does not reach statistical significance. So we do see a significant increase in bankruptcies after the reform, as we would expect, and overall the elite individuals are more likely to file for bankruptcy, but we only find some moderate support for the hypothesis that more elite individuals will be more likely to file for bankruptcy after the reform. Next, looking at foundings, our dependent variables now founding a reform after the reform, and so we can see that compared to pre-reform, after the bankruptcy reform, those from elite universities and also those who are older are significantly more likely to enter into entrepreneurship and found a firm after the reforms. And then finally, the performance results, looking at the cumulative sales growth. We see we use a control group of those from primary industries. And so the primary industries are essentially the traditional industries, mainly farming, coal mining, logging. And so in these industries, we expect them to be less affected by the reforms because these are areas where elite entrepreneurs are less likely to go into, and they're also typically more governed by people entering into these industries if that's what their parents did. So if your parents were farmers in Japan, then you're significantly more likely to become a farmer yourself. And so we expect not to see the results here. And indeed, that's what we find in the results, that the primary industries as our control group are unaffected. However, when we turn to the elite founders, we find that those from the elite universities tended to have higher growth overall, they particularly have higher growth post-reform. So both in terms of those from elite universities and those who were older, we see that they have significantly higher growth post-reform. And so this again points to this idea that not only are more elite entrepreneurs founding firms, but they appear to be going after higher value opportunities and managing more effectively. Check for robustness of the findings, a number of ways. Nonetheless, we have some limitations that we want to address in interpreting these results, which is that since this is a national level reform, we lack a true control sample. And so we do differences and differences, but ideally you'd really want a triple difference with some group that was not affected by the reforms. Second limitation is how do you parse the effects of multiple reforms that happen cumulatively, as in the case of Japan over this time period. And then third, our measures of elites are limited to school and age. However, these do appear to be factors that are associated with higher performance in entrepreneurship. And then finally, it's difficult to estimate the larger social welfare implications. In bankruptcy reform, there are always trade-offs between creditors, entrepreneurs, and employees. So, as I mentioned already, we do attempt to address this limitation of lack of a control group by looking at the primary or traditional industries. And so this allows us to better isolate the effect of the reform. So I already showed these results where you don't see the effect in the primary industries, but you do see significant effect from the elite entrepreneurs. So finally, to summarize our findings, we find that after bankruptcy reform, lowering the failure barriers, elite entrepreneurs are more likely to declare bankruptcy and also more likely to start firms. And after the reforms, we get higher performing firms, both due to more elite founders, but also greater performance out of those elite founders. Theoretical contributions, we introduced the concept of failure barrier and show that it has implications for both the type of individual becoming an entrepreneur, but also in terms of the firm performance of those firms that are created. This allows us to have a richer understanding of the relationship between institutions, founding, failure, and the resulting type of entrepreneurs and firm performance. So while previous literature has primarily focused on the barriers to entry and on founding, we showed that for generating higher performing firms and for getting more of the best and brightest to become entrepreneurs, we should really be focused more on reforms on bankruptcy law, which make it easier and less punitive to go through the bankruptcy process. And so I feel that motivating elite individuals to become entrepreneurs is a key strategy for improving economic growth through entrepreneurship. So overall, if you remember one thing from this talk, it's that lowering entry barriers can determine whether you can start a firm, but lowering the barriers to failure can help determine whether the best and the brightest will want to start one. Thank you very much.